we're going to change up a few things here in 2023, which I had been wanting to do for a while now, just not doing music type interviews and arts type interviews, but kind of going beyond that. So this year, I'm speaking with some more leaders and creators, as I've always promised. And this episode actually will be a two-parter because it's so long. It kind of delves into a little bit with my interest in running. And I've been listening to this one podcast called the Big Peach Ride and Run podcast, and I really like its host. So I was like, hey, would you come on mine and we'll talk for a little bit? And Dave Martinez is head of marketing for the Big Peach Running Company, which is a really nice running store here in Atlanta. And they also, in a few of those locations, he'll talk about this a little bit too, they have some stuff for cyclists. So, like high-end bikes and things like that. But Big Peach is great if you want to go there and get really nice running shoes, and they figure out your fit much better than most of your running stores. So we talk a little bit about that, and Dave has a little bit of background in television, actually quite a bit, and so do I. And we talk a little bit about that, not too much shop. And so I hope you enjoy it. This is going to be a two-parter. So here's part one. So how did you get into television? Where did you go to school, and how did that all work out?
I, grew up primarily down in Florida and Orlando. And so I went to, middle school, high school, and went to University of Central Florida. And that's kind of where I started kind of getting a little bit into that production side. Funny thing was, originally I was thinking about getting into architecture and getting into engineering, and then quickly found out that, I'm not really good at math or science.
It
So
kind of has to come with it, doesn't it?
yeah, I enjoyed the drawing part and the idea and the
I agree.
creative part of it, but not the science. So I never really fully got into that engineering program. And so I started kind of looking at other things that I could kind of get into. And, was always had a bit of a creative side, always kind of liked to draw, but never thought that I could make a career out of it. So I never took it seriously, never took classes, and enjoyed music as well. So I started kind of looking at options, and, Full Sail was like down the street from where I lived. It was like, maybe half a mile. And so I was like, oh, well, let me check out, their facilities. This is a kind of interesting thing, a career in music, and, as a, studio engineer and audio engineer. And went through, did the tour and checked it out. I'm like, wow, they got some really nice stuff. And found out that the cost was just astronomical. I mean, it's like they rush you through. I mean, they just crank people out. I don't know if it's still the same case, but, and they've done some great things right now with computer animation. They've got some, students that have, gotten, Oscars and Emmys and some of the, big blockbuster films like Marvel and Pixar these days. But at the time, I think it was like $18,000 for like 9 months. And this is back in 94, 95, so that's a lot of money. I was like, at the time, I think that's what it would cost to go to Princeton or Harvard, per year. And so I was like, well, that's kind of expensive. So I started taking some additional classes, and it's like, well, if I want to get into this, let me find out if this is something I'm interested in. So I went to the community college and took some audio engineering classes there. It's just some basic entry stuff, learning how to work a large studio board and understanding microphones and acoustics and, live production, and just sort of like that intro into it. And I was really fascinated by it. And then, when I was at Central Florida, I ended up taking a lot of television production classes, and found that came to me very naturally. And there were some things that we were working on that even back then I had no idea that would lead me to where, eventually kind of helped me along the path. Was we were working on a project, working with studio cameras, and we had antiquated equipment. We were still working on 3/4 inch tape. Wow. When everyone else was working on beta, and some very antiquated equipment, but we made it work. It taught us the process, and we had old tube style type of, cameras, at that time. And so we had to do, I think the during that production course, we had to learn, kind of television graphics, and kind of do it old school. So it was like poster board or whatever. And so I created, this poster board, to put in front of a camera. And it was dark. It was like, I think back then it was the Batman animated series, that was, going on. And so I was a fan of that. And so I created this, still graphic, obviously, made a poster board, and it was just cut out a shape with, ink, just regular pen for the shading and anything like that. But it was a black poster board with like dark blue for, Batman, the silhouette, and maybe like a yellow beam for the spotlight. And then just, I think, white text or something as like a promo, like a still graphic to promote, an end slate for a graphic. And the instructor saw that. He goes, I don't know how well that's going to look on camera. He goes, that's all really kind of dark. And he put it on camera and it looked fantastic. It really, everything popped out. And so I didn't think much of it. And, I learned the what I could learn at school there, and then got an internship at the local NBC station. And luckily, it was a paid internship. You don't see a whole lot of those in television. So it was a paid internship. So it was like a part-time job. And that's where my education, in television production really took advantage of that, learning everything I possibly could. Obviously starting at the basics, learning how to floor direct on, newscast, they had robotic cameras. So learn robotic cameras, learn audio, learn back then was, their computer graphics, and what we in the industry refer to as Chiron, yes. And it was the old, we had floppy disk. We had the big old, 5-inch floppy disk to load fonts or to save graphics. That's how old the equipment was. And then later, several years later, I think we ended up getting upgraded to the Infinite, Chiron, and that just brought things up to a higher level of graphics and what you could do with it. And but learned all that, and then downtime, I started learning how to edit, on tape, and going linear to linear, tapes, and we had D2 machines, so first kind of digital tape, and and that's where we ended up getting a video cube. So I started learning how to do that. And, this is kind of like on downtime or coming on the weekends, learn how to pick up a, beta cam and start shooting, went out with a lot of the photographers, assigned myself projects. So very, I took that opportunity to just absorb as much as I could, learn from a lot of people there. And eventually, that led to a full-time job and, at that station. And so kept continuing to learn more and more and more. And then it was one of those things where kind of a side project, I started learning, Photoshop and Illustrator on the side at home. A couple of us, this is kind of when the .com and everyone was getting into websites. Right. And so we're like, we're going to be website designers, So we had a couple of friends of ours. So I started learning how to code and learn HTML. And so we started doing that. And it ended up that our TV station was looking to have their own website. So position became open in the art department for someone to be the web designer. And so I applied for it and got it. So that made me cross over from the production side into the art side. So, yeah. And it then turned out that because of, I think, a recent acquisition with, Hearst TV or whatever, the Hearst Group, they're a bigger, operation. So they ended up basically saying, well, the website, that's all going to be done kind of on a corporate level. We've got a company that's going to handle and do it across the entire entity of all of our station groups. So at that point, I started like, okay, well, I'm in the art department, so I got to learn how to do graphics for TV. So I started learning that, and we had the Liberty Paint system from Chiron. Started learning that, and then started learning, motion graphics. We had, a small little, Mac there that had, After Effects on it. Like I think it was like After Effects like 3 or something like that. I mean, very, very early on, and started learning how to do that, and did that for about a year or two, and really kind of honed my skills. And then we had, I got actually poached by a competitor, a station, a local station, down the street, who was looking for a senior designer. And they basically said, reached out to me. I was kind of recommended by my previous boss, my previous art director who had moved, on. So I started working there, and they had a really nice setup. So I started doing a lot more creative stuff, working more with After Effects, but then also started learning 3D Studio Max. And they also had Lightwave at the time. So these are all 3D type of animation and modeling type of programs. And I ended up taking classes, I think, again, at the community college to learn more about 3D Studio Max, and then sort of started combining that with After Effects to, create things, and started really kind of expanding what I could do on a desktop computer and being very creative. And I was there for a little bit over a year when a position once again opened up in here in Atlanta, where they were looking for an art director. And once again, my previous boss, who had recommended me for that one job, said, hey, here's a guy who's, really talented, and I think he's, ready to make that move. So I ended up applying and moving up to Atlanta, and got the job as an art director. So I was, did that position for a little over 8 years. It was, the way TV works, as far as, especially if you're management or even talent, it's on, typically it's 4-year contracts.
Yeah.
And so I ended up going through 2 4-year contracts. At the end of that 4-year contract, it was one of those, it was like end of 2008, just when everything was kind of, recession was and they basically said, sorry, we're not going to renew your contract, and I was like, okay, well, this kind of sucks. I was like, what am I going to do? I was like, well, I have all these skills. I have all this knowledge. What can I do? So I started kind of doing some freelance work, and then, did that for a while, did some stuff at some of the cable channels, and over at Turner, had some connections there, did some stuff even for my old TV station there, because I had some people there that really appreciated the work that I did, and gave me some jobs. But, 2009, 2010, the economy's still not doing great. Everyone's still pulling back their resources. Everything's coming in-house, less, money available for freelancing. And what ended up happening at that point was, well, even, during that time, as soon as I started kind of working from home, I ended up getting more into running.
Yeah. Oh, so that's how the running just I would always get the impression every time I talk with somebody who's into running, they've been doing it since high school or something like that. But I think people like us, have found it in adulthood. So
yeah, I mean, a lot of us, I think the majority of us find it in adulthood, and I had been running kind of off and on, but not really seriously. Like, I always hated running. I would run a race because my friends were doing it or whatever, and I never trained for it, a 5K or something like that. And afterwards, I would be in so much pain. I'd like, that's it, I'm done. Running's not for me. I have bad knees. My knees hurt. And, one of the things that happens when you're working in TV, and you can relate to this, is that, especially when, election nights or breaking news, or just in news in general, it's like, you're on almost around the clock. It's 24/7, news never stops, right? News never sleeps.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's hard to, eat on a schedule. And whenever there is, it's like, oh, it's Friday. Hey, donuts Friday morning, or hey, pizza for lunch, or hey, it's election night. Everyone gets Chick-fil-A. So, and you never really eat properly. So you're either going out to get something down the street at a fast food restaurant, or you're eating out of a vending machine. So my health, wasn't, I mean, I wasn't unhealthy, but I'd put on some weight. And there were times where I even attempted to bike commute. So I lived over in Decatur and was riding over to, down to Midtown where the station was at.
Wow.
And as a way to kind of, okay, well, let me just drop some weight. Let me get healthier. And I had always been kind of a cyclist more than a runner. And, it was one of those things that all of a sudden it's like, hey, we have an 8 o'clock meeting, you should be here. I'm like, all right. I'm like, well, I can't commute and be at the station, showered and everything, by 8. If I got to leave at like 5:30 in the morning if I'm going to ride this distance, and then I'm riding in the dark, and
Right.
there's traffic, and it's unsafe,
Atlanta.
and it's Atlanta, right? And then it's like, oh, we have a post meeting after our 7 o'clock newscast. So I'm there from 8 to almost 8 o'clock at night. It's a 12-hour day, and like, I'm not riding in the dark either. So that threw that out of the window. And so when you're working, 50, 60 hours a week, there's no time really to exercise. So as soon as I had the opportunity to work from home, it was one of those things where I said, you know what? I always said that if I had more time, I would be in better shape.
Oh yeah.
Now I've got all the time in the world. I make my own schedule. So I started, when everyone else was at work, I would go out to run. I wouldn't get up early like 6 a.m. Like, why would I? I have no place to be. So I'd get up and run like, when everyone's like, in at 9, 10 o'clock in the morning, I'm like, that's when I was going out and getting my run. And so I started slowly, just doing it on a little bit more consistent basis. But I knew I needed, a good pair of shoes, because what I
Right.
was running at the time, I had bought somewhere, cheap or whatever. And I'd been into, Big Peach Running Company before, but like I said, off and on, I wasn't really serious. I'd given it up. And so I actually went to the Big Peach store in Decatur. And they were really great. The service was phenomenal. I still remember what shoe I picked out. It was like the Saucony Ride, version 5.
Yeah.
And it was that and another shoe potentially, but that's the one I went with. And they were like, hey, we've got a group run tonight. If you want to come out and join us for a group run, I was like, all right. And so I came back later that evening, and it turns out that it was right around the same time period, like in February, and it was a Mardi Gras themed run. So they had king cake and they had beer afterwards, and I was like, I could get into this. I was like, you go out for a run and you have like, a beer afterwards or some cake or something like that, sort of kind of as a reward. I'm like, I could get into this. And so they had regular runs where they had, beer or, other things, or they brought in vendors you can try on shoes. And so I started going on a regular basis. I started going twice a week. Plus, so that was Tuesday and Thursday nights. Plus I was running, during the day, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or on the weekend. So I started to get that consistency in running that I never had before. And all of a sudden, a light bulb kind of went off. And it was like, I'm like, I thought I had bad knees.
Yeah.
My knees always hurt. They're not hurting anymore. They hurt it at the beginning, but they don't hurt now.
Yeah.
And it was later that year where, I signed up to do a training program with the Atlanta Track Club for the Peachtree Road Race. And I'd done the Peachtree before, but same thing. Afterwards, I'm like, that's it. I'm done. I'm not a runner. My knees hurt. And was going out every week. Every Saturday morning they had a group run from that Decatur store, and so I would go out and run, and I was feeling great. And by the next time, when I did the Peachtree that year, I had taken, I think, 10, 15 minutes off my previous Peachtree time, and I was like, wow, this is amazing, and I feel great. I'm not hurting afterwards. I had an awesome time.
Yeah.
And so after that is where I said, okay, the key is consistency. So how do I keep myself going? How do I keep myself accountable? And I was like, I need another race. So
All
I
right.
signed up for a half marathon, I think in October, and did that. And I was like, and then ended up taking, I think that was the first time I ran under 2 hours for a half marathon. Or maybe right at 2 hours. Cause I think my previous one had been like 2 hours and 35 minutes. So I ended up taking a significant chunk of time. I mean, imagine taking 30 minutes off of a half marathon. I was like, oh
That's
my
very
God,
good.
I am pumped. This is awesome. I feel great. And so then it was like, okay, I need another half marathon. So I, signed up. And back then that marathon was the ING marathon in March, which has since become the Publix marathon.
Right.
And once again, I was like, I took like another 5 minutes off my time. And after that, I was like hooked. I was like, oh, half marathons, half marathons. So every year I was doing, 2 to 3 half marathons, plus throw in the Peachtree. And then I'd throw in some 5K, 10Ks, along the line. Little did I know that that would then spur this interest to do more. And it was actually, I think it may have been at that expo at ING. If it wasn't that one, it was the following year. But I remember going to the expo, walking, and this is back when the expos were huge, where you had brands with big booths, and it was just, you had so much stuff. I mean, it was like the whole convention center was filled. And walked in and saw, this little, 10 by 10, booth with a little tent there, and it said Atlanta Triathlon Club. And living in Florida, there's triathletes everywhere. And it's something that had crossed my mind.
Yeah.
But the swim part scared the hell out of me.
Yeah,
because
I
I'd
don't like
heard
swimming.
stories. Yeah, I'm not a
Yeah.
good swimmer. I mean, I could not drown, I guess, in the sense that, I knew how to tread water, right? But I
Yeah.
didn't know how to swim properly. I didn't know the proper technique and have that skill. I just knew how not to drown, and tread water. And I'd heard stories of, of these races with the mass starts where you get kicked and get pushed under. And I was like, that's not me. I don't want to do that. So that always prevented me from really diving into triathlon, especially when I lived in Florida. So here I see a group, and I see these two women, and and I started talking to them about the program and what do they do, and and their training and all that, and found out that they had done, I think a couple of them had done several Ironman distances. And what I saw is they were not what you would consider your typical Ironman finisher.
Yeah. Yeah. Not physically. Yeah.
Physically, they were not the skinny,
Right.
5% body
You
fat.
expect. Yeah.
I mean, these were heavy women. I mean, and they were able to accomplish something that I thought I could never do. And combined with seeing them as a kind of an example of what could be done, that it wasn't physically based on the way you looked. And my kind of newfound, desire to challenge myself and see things that I had physically not been able to do and see improvement. I said, all right, let me find out more. And so I ended up going to like an info session and learning more about them, and signed up and started. It's like, all right, first day in the pool, and little
Mm.
by little doing more and learning more about the club. But my goal was, I just want to do one triathlon. I don't, short distance, whatever that distance is,
Yeah.
and kind of checking off and saying, done, across the finish line, I'm a triathlete, right? Yeah, I could put that in my, personal resume. I've done a
Yeah.
triathlon. I'm a triathlete, right? I've got that label. That was the goal. And of course, you're around all these individuals that, afterwards you find out that they're trained for this Ironman Wisconsin or Ironman Florida, and you're like, what? Ironman? I was like, I don't know what that is. And it was still a bit intimidating because of the distance and what they were training for. And I'm like, I could never do that.
Mm.
There's no way I could do that, you know? And so I did that first one and completed it. And I'm like, okay, great. I survived. Funny thing is that when I finished, I'm like, I think I want to do another one.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was like, I
Yeah.
feel okay. I'm like, I got the training. It was hard, but could I do, another, triathlon? And I think I ended up doing like maybe one more, but I kept training with the group because I figured it was a good way of kind of staying consistent. Once again, keeping up with swimming. I won't say I really enjoyed swimming until much later, but I figure it was a necessity, to continue to do triathlons, is to improve my swimming. And it was over that winter, I think, where I was like, I really want to focus and do more. Can I take the next step and do a half Ironman? So I think if it wasn't my second, it was my third triathlon. I signed up for, at the time, it was Gulf Coast triathlon, which is down in Panama City. I think it's been bought out. It's an Ironman branded event, but it's a half Ironman. And I was like, okay, I signed up for it, start training. And I remember talking to one of my swim coaches, the head swim coach, and I said something. I was like, yep, I signed up. I'm doing Gulf Coast. And she looked at me and she goes, really? And I'm like, oh, what does she know that I don't know?
Oh
I'm
no.
like, is she like not sure of my capabilities? Because, and it turns out it has to do really with the conditions, because
Yeah.
it's so unpredictable. It could be glass, 1 minute or one day or 1 year. And then, another day, another year, it could be like a washing machine where it's just so rough, it's windy. And that was a concern. Luckily, I think the day before the race, went out and did a little practice swim, and it was kind of choppy out there. I'm like, okay, it's like, it'll be what it'll be. But on race morning, it was flat. It was completely glassy. Water was clear. It was a peaceful, beautiful swim. As far as, I don't remember what my time was. It by no means was, I would say, was fast. I was probably, more of like, middle of the pack, middle half of the, middle back of the pack. But I enjoyed it. I was like, oh man, this is so peaceful. This is so great. And I've completed it. And once again, I was like, all right, that was tough. Running a half marathon after, a 56-mile bike, that was tough. And of course, it ended up getting hotter. At that point, by the time you're done, you're running like 90+ degree heat, in Florida, and sun's out, no shade, and easily, 90% humidity. So I got done. I'm like, okay, well, that was great. Check, I'm a half Ironman. And I think later that year, same thing. I was like, oh, I'm going to do another. I think I ended up doing, Augusta, half Ironman in Augusta, Georgia. And same thing, very similar conditions. It's a river swim, so you're swimming with a current. So it's an easier swim, but it's very cold and, and I had some difficulty at the start, just because you get that little bit of anxiety if you don't swim in open water or you're thrown into a condition we're not used to. For me at least, I tend to get a little bit of an anxiety attack, and so I had to calm myself down. But after that, had a great race. Once again, no big record. It was just one of those things like, great, checked another, off. And I think it was like that third year where I decided I'm finally up to doing an Ironman, and didn't even tell anyone. I think there was maybe one or two people. It was like in September, and I think I started kind of letting the cat out of bag in like August. But I've been training for it all year because I was like, what if I can't do it? What if I can't make it? I don't want to disappoint anyone, or and be maybe even judged by it. And so as I got closer, I started getting more confidence when I ended up doing it. I think that was 2013. And then did that. Obviously had some issues there because you can never have a perfect race. It's always a nutrition issue or something else that comes up. And did that. And I was like, all right, I'm like, the following year is 2014. And they were talking, there was rumors about it already. It's like there was going to be Ironman Chattanooga.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, oh, well, yeah. It's like, but it's right up the road.
Yeah.
Because part of it, I mean, I think the biggest, barrier really to triathlon in general is the expense for the equipment. And it could be as expensive or inexpensive as you want. If you want the latest, greatest, high-tech bike, you're going to spend several $1,000s on a bike, but you don't need to have one.
Yeah.
But then you have the entry fee, which is easily several $100s. I mean, we're talking close to $1,000 per entry at this point, I think. So that could be a barrier for anyone wanting to do that type of race. And then you throw in the travel and the hotel on top of it.
Sure.
And let's say, traveling with a bike, that just adds cost upon cost. So for me, I'm like, I could drive up the road to Chattanooga, and that saves me airfare, saves me in shipping a bike. So I'm saving some money there. So I was like, I've got to do it, and so I ended up doing it. Whole club was out there. We had we had close to, I think over 70, maybe 100 people within the club that were doing it. We had people join in on the club just because it was so, it was Chattanooga as well. And so did it. Once again, wasn't the greatest of races. I had still some nutrition issues, but I did it, and I had a fantastic time. And it was one of those things afterwards. I was like, okay, well, do I want to do another? Do I want to do another Ironman? Is this what I want to do? Is can keep pursuing Ironmans? And everyone always talks about, much like if you're a runner, you talk about, a BQ, a Boston qualification.
Right.
In triathlon, it's a KQ, it's a Kona qualification. It's to qualify for the World Championships at Kona. And, during that time when I was training for Ironman, I was like, maybe it's possible, I wonder if I could, train. And so after doing two of them, and based on my age group at the time, because I was right in that, 40 to 45 age group. And I think that's a very competitive. I mean, it's one of the largest groups. I think within 40 to 50 is one of the largest, groups. When you look at that, it just ramps up. When you look at age group, it's like, that's the peak. That's where all the talent is. And that's where the largest amount of, at least age groupers, that's where they're all at. And looking at the times and the qualifications, of course, it started getting faster and faster and faster. And the I think in order to even be considered to qualify in that age group, you had to finish like somewhere around the 10 hour 15, minute, time period. So my times were in the 12 and a half hour. So I would easily have to take over 2 hours off of my total triathlon time. I'm like,
Seriously.
well, where do I take that? Where can I?
Yeah.
I'm like, how much faster can I get on a swim? I was like, well, maybe I could take 5 minutes, here, I mean, if I really focus, maybe 10 minutes. That's a lot of work. And that's for a short amount of time. That's not where you're going to really make up that time. It's got to be on the bike and the run. And I'm like, well, that means I'd have to at least, depending on how you want to figure it out, it's like have to take off at least, almost an hour off the bike and almost an hour off the run. I'm like, there's no way I can do that, in my mind.
Yeah.
Yes, physically you can. If you really put the effort into it, you can. But one of the things that I have kind of realized back then is that in order for me to put that amount of work, it does become work.
Oh, it is.
And at a certain point, when does that no longer become fun? If you're pursuing a time, if you're pursuing and chasing that goal, and I'm not saying you shouldn't, if that's something you want to do, and this is every individual has to kind of make that decision. But for me, by the time I get to the start of the race and I put in that amount of work, am I really going to enjoy it? Or am I already going to hate, what I at one point found fun. And because the amount of training, the amount of work that goes into it. And it's one of the same reasons why I stopped chasing a Boston qualification was because I had to take like 30 minutes off of my time, and I just like, no, I'm still going to run. I'm still going to bike. I'm still going to do all these things, but I'm not going to chase that because I don't want my focus to be on one particular sport and chasing a time goal and then lose the fun aspect of it. Because when you lose, at least for me, if I lose the fun part of it, then why am I doing it?
Yeah.
And then I give it up altogether.
It's true.
So I decided sort of kind of, I guess, officially or unofficially to retire from triathlon. I'm sure at one point down the road, I may jump in on another triathlon. And even then I've kind of toyed with the idea of like, maybe I should do one 10 years later, the last one I did was 2014, maybe 2024, I go back in and see, just compare and have I gotten better? Have I gotten slower? Did I do the same thing as a way of maybe measuring fitness over 10 years? It's an idea that I've floated, but I haven't committed to anything. But I wanted to use kind of what I'd learned, and because I think there's more things that you can do, and my focus started to change a little bit. I started thinking about, I've always had an interest in trail running and running off-road.
Yeah. I know a lot of people getting into that. Yeah.
Yeah, and even during that time period, I was still every once in a while would go and do like anywhere from the 3 to 6 mile trail run, because I did find that it worked different parts of the body that running on a level asphalt, surface doesn't work. And I remember right after I did Ironman Chattanooga, I think it was like a month later, I went and did a 6 mile trail run. And here I am, like I just did over 140 miles. I am in the best shape of my life. I've already recovered. Let me go out. Let me do, 6 miles. I mean, heck, I just did a marathon after a 100, plus mile bike ride. I can do this, right? And of course, I could do it. And I went out and did it, enjoyed it. The next day, I am feeling all sorts of soreness in the lower legs that I'd never felt in any of my marathon training. Why? Because I'm running on uneven surfaces.
Right.
I've got tendons and things around the ankles, and and I was like, I'm like, this is different. This truly tells me that, running on a level surface on a straight, kind of straight without any turns or anything, does leave you kind of open to some deficiencies and some imbalances in your body. So at that point, I was like, I think I'm going to jump up, and I've done some trail races. I'm like, I think I'm going to go up and do a 50K. I'm like,
Nice. Yeah.
what's a 50K? I just, I mean, that you're talking about almost 32 miles. I just did over 140 miles, over 12 hours. So I signed up to do one up in Blue Ridge, and it was one of those where I was a little bit overconfident, because someone asked us, like, well, what do you think your time will be? I'm like, well, it's 32 miles. It's about 6 more miles than a marathon. My last marathon was, right at 4 hours. So with the elevation, let's say 6 hours. I mean, it seems reasonable when you kind of put it that, right? Give me some
That
time to
makes
maybe
sense. Yeah.
right? Man, it is a different beast altogether. That was, I think that race, ended up being just over 8 hours.
A little
Uh,
hillier than you thought. So that's
uh, for sure, a
great.
lot, yes, for a lot hillier. And those 6 miles, especially I would say the last 6 miles, the last 10K is where you really kind of suffer. Because that's where the legs start really
Uh,
cramping. You start kind of wondering, did I take enough, salt tablets? How much am I sweating? And oddly enough, that first one was in November, so it was actually cool weather. So I think that also led me to believe that maybe I didn't need enough salt. Maybe I wasn't sweating it, enough, and I didn't take in enough. So, so it was one of those things where I was like, it was very humbling to come in and kind of not not meet the expectation that I sort of kind of had, but it was also a very eye-opening experience and gave me a lot of respect, I think, for that distance. And I think the same thing happened when I did my first marathon. And after that, I started doing more 50Ks than anything else and doing more trail running. And I think the following year, I think I ended up doing like 3 or 4. I think I did 350Ks in like a 4 week time period.
ooh, ooh,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
hurts.
yeah. And the first one I did, I ended up doing up in like North Georgia, like right around the border of Georgia, North Carolina. Sky Valley, and same thing, very hilly, up in Raven County.
Oh yeah.
Um, and I was so sore, and I had another 50K the following week, and I was like, I don't know that I'm going to make it to the start line. And luckily, I was able to recover enough. I think by that following Wednesday, middle of the week, I was able to do a run. I'm going, okay, I'm not hurting quite as bad. And I was like, I just need to ease, slowly, stretch out the muscles. And I ended up doing that second one, and and I had a good race. Did a third one, same thing. I'm like, okay, I'm like, this is good. Then it came, I think the following year, I was doing something very similar. Once again, lots of 50Ks, lots of running. And I think by the time I got to the last race of the season, which was like mid-November, I was burned out.
So we're gonna stop it right there. Dave's talking about a lot of his work doing a lot of running, and he's into triathlons and things like that. So gets into a lot of stuff that I can't totally relate to, especially that in trail running. It would be a lot of fun. I'd love to get into trail running, but I'm not terribly into that. I like the road races and races that are with a cause. I really enjoy doing that. So that's the end of part one. And then the next episode, which will be in about 2 weeks, we'll have the rest of this in part two, where we go into a little bit more about the Big Peach Running Company and everything that they do. And hope you enjoy. I mean, this is definitely more for the people who are into the running activity and cycling, more so than a lot of the other episodes where we talk more about the arts and more current event type stuff. So this is kind of a little bit more of a self-interest type podcast. So we will see you in approximately 2 weeks when we'll have the next episode.